Hello everybody, welcome to these Mesothelioma UK interviews. We have been running a series of interviews and I hope you found them helpful. Today I'm delighted to be speaking to Charles Pickles. Charles has been instrumental on the asbestos, airtight on asbestos campaign, which is a UK-wide campaign focusing on asbestos in public buildings. And unfortunately, the healthcare risks and problems that asbestos can create. So welcome, Charles.
Yeah, perhaps I'll begin by saying a few words about myself and how I got interested in this sort of thing. Well, I started in asbestos consultancy in April 1999. Yeah, that's when I started. So I've been doing it for actually 20 plus years now. And after about 4 or 5 years working for small companies, I decided it was time to see if I could start out on my own. So with a business partner. So in 2002, I started a company called Lucian, which did very, very well, dare I say it. And I exited that company, sold my shares in it about in May last year. So I now live in Durham, which is where I've lived in the northeast for the last 20 years or so, with my wife and three children. So I became, well, I suppose during my 20 years consultancy with working in the asbestos consultancy, I had my eyes open really quite early on. I was asked to work on a power station abroad, and I'd only been doing the job about a year or so, and I didn't really know much about the risks. So there I was as a young man in at the sharp end of it with asbestos, working in all these tunnels riddled with brown asbestos debris lying everywhere, and we were just walking around the place, and I just had a sort of paper mask on or no mask on at the time. It was only about, I don't know, 15 years after that I began to reflect on that experience and indeed that exposure, because I'm measured, so I know what the levels were at the time, and they were far above the clearance indicator on a routine basis. So I then kind of began to scrutinize the legislation, the guidance and the practice that had supposedly been keeping me safe and indeed keeping society safe since the bans on asbestos came into place, and before that really the practice of managing asbestos in situ. Now, the management of asbestos in situ is based on this overwhelming presumption, which is that asbestos in situ is safe unless it's disturbed. But it is disturbed. It doesn't really need to be disturbed that much to give off the dust. So therein lies the fundamental flaw of the practice of managing asbestos in situ. I strongly advocate that around about 95% of all the asbestos we have, somewhere in between 90 and 95%, can be managed perfectly safely in situ, but the remaining 5% is, to put it in colloquial language, a bit too hot to handle. It's a bit too risky. So it was, I suppose, a friend of mine, I won't mention his name, he died of a cancer when he was 42, and he was someone I knocked around with every day at work, so we were just taking a mickey out of each other non-stop in the laboratory, particularly on Saturday mornings. And then he came to see me one day and says, Charles, I've been diagnosed with bowel cancer. And this was a bit of a shock. It shook me up a lot, really. And basically, he went downhill over the next year and a half and died. And then it was only about 2 or 3 months after that I found myself taken by some illness. And there I was in the haematology wards of a Freeman Hospital in Newcastle, looking at all these other patients dying and suffering and hopefully recovering from 1 or 2, the various forms of cancer. And I thought, whoa, I've been exposed, not heavily exposed to asbestos, getting on for 15, 20 years ago. I'm now, by that stage, I was running the biggest asbestos consultancy in the UK, and I kind of don't have any faith in the regime from which I'm earning a living. So it's really, I just thought, well, this is a bit skew if this could be improved upon. So at that stage, I decided really to start to write about where I think practice could be improved, and indeed to talk about it. So that's really how I started to get involved in asbestos awareness. Needless to say, I've been doing asbestos awareness kind of non-stop in my day job. My day job was asbestos awareness for 20 years, albeit some was formal training, but most of it was ad hoc training. But then I decided to really look at the fundamental basis of how we manage asbestos in situ, and I think it could be improved upon quite significantly and quite pragmatically, and I therefore feel compelled to speak out about that, because I consider it to be, I'm going to consider it to be a clear and current danger. So over to you, Lorraine.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've done a tremendous amount of work and research and just advocacy and awareness, which is tremendous. What would you say about the way the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, record data on asbestos exposure?
All mesothelioma deaths are counted, but they're only ascribed an occupation for deaths under the age of 75. I'm sorry to be talking about deaths, but that's the nature of the beast.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So what that means is that now it used to be less than half. Currently, half of all mesothelioma deaths are not ascribed an occupation to them. But that trend is going. So perhaps in 10 years' time, we'll be missing the occupational data for 75% of all the mesothelioma deaths. Now, asbestos has changed from an occupational disease. It's not people sawing up asbestos sheets on building sites. It's not dockers handling asbestos in the shipyards. It's not insulators. It's not laggers, and it's not people manufacturing asbestos in plants. All the asbestos which was imported, manufactured, and put in the built environment, it's been dispersed. So really, we have an environmental problem, or a building stock. Call it what you will. It's not an occupational thing. Think of it as an occupational hazard or a building hazard now, rather than an occupational hazard. Therefore, the statistical basis on which we gather the data has to catch up with the fact that we're not mining, milling, manufacturing, and installing asbestos, but it's in the built environment. So to class it as an occupational disease rather than an environmental disease is increasingly wrong. And can we see that in the trend of decreasing percentage of people who are captured by the official occupational disease data of data under the age of 75. Now, that actually matters because there's no other way in which we can capture official government data on where this epidemic, killing 5,000 people a year, is coming from. It also matters for a number of other reasons, which is that the percentage of ladies who catch mesothelioma later in life is higher percentage of men. So more women are excluded from the official statistics. And So really, the big thing is we need to recognize that we've banned asbestos, and it is no longer therefore an occupational disease, but it is increasingly an environmental disease. So that's my views really on that one. Thank you, Lorraine.
So I mean, we've got that massive shift, haven't we, which you just described, for me seeing people in a healthcare environment, in clinics, and presenting in that way, with all the knowledge that we've got about people coming through these high-risk occupations like you just covered, like the builders, the laggers, the shipbuilders, to people who have now been in a low occupational risk or an environmental risk. And we have a study, we have to study that and make sure our awareness changes according to that. Charles, can you just put your laptop screen so I can get a full face? That's what I want. That's great. So can you just comment on that a little? I'm sure you just have, but you know, it is a big shift in awareness, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big shift in awareness. There's another big point which I thought of, and I've promptly forgotten. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me a minute. Now that's it. There's an important point. This is the power of legislation. Because we banned asbestos 20 years ago now, the level of the level of exposure in the environment is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude lower than it was when we were working with the stuff directly. The level of exposure is significantly lower. So what that means is that people have been exposed, less exposed, and that they will live longer. So what that means is, again, the 75-year cutoff is going to be increasingly irrelevant because people are going to be living longer. Now, which is a good thing, definitely a good thing. But they are living longer. But it does mean that the way in which we catch that statistical data needs to recognise that fundamental change in the nature of exposure. We've dispersed the problem. We've dispersed the problem.
So we now are faced with moving on from that great big occupational risks to a cultural and institutional change in awareness and how we protect and advise people who may still be having asbestos exposure.
Yeah, I mean, we've dispersed. You know, we're continually thinking about. We used to think about asbestos workers. Now we think about predominantly tradespeople. But don't forget that asbestos is everywhere in the built environment, and because we are living longer generally as a society, and because we're exposed younger at a younger age in life, the disease has a longer time to manifest itself. So those are 2 kind of important points to take into account there, which I'll touch on the age thing really. So as opposed to in an occupational setting, you wouldn't have been exposed to asbestos before you left school. So let's say 16 to 20, typically back in the day when people started work. But because the people who are put asbestos into schools, it is, and a lot of amosite asbestos, AIB, namely into class schools, then people are going to get exposed, not at age, they're going to get exposed 10 years earlier. Now, you've got to remember that the risk of mesothelioma doubles for every 10 years earlier in life you're exposed to the asbestos. So that shift of putting it into schools really means that there's a much higher chance, unfortunately, of children developing it later on in life. After that, we're expected to live longer, which is a good thing. So if you like, we've got a double whammy. People are exposed younger and they're expected to live younger. Bearing in mind the risk of catching mesothelioma increases for every additional decade the disease has to manifest itself within the body. If we're exposed 10 years older, younger, rather, and expected to live 10 years older, let's say, then you've got a ×4 increase in the likelihood of a given person with a certain exposure contracting mesothelioma. So don't expect this one to go away. Therefore, the way we gather the statistics really needs to start reflecting those 2 or 3 different changes there.
I suppose we should just make sure that people are aware that there can be that latency period between being in contact with asbestos to actually developing an asbestos-related disease or mesothelioma, which can be anything from 30, 40, 50 years going forward. Sorry?
The latency period is perhaps why asbestos is the UK's #1 killer. It kills far more people than radiation, than fire, than electricity, all these things which zap you straight away, and it can, you know, it doesn't catch the headlines like Grenfell, for example. Grenfell killed, I think it was 87 people. Well, asbestos kills that number of people every week, and it just does it later in life and on a one-to-one basis. But if the reason it kills so many people is because of that latency period, and because the consequences are so well disassociated in time and geography from the exposure. So that's why we really need to get very much more firm on the monitoring of asbestos in situ, because in the vast majority of a majority of our public buildings, we don't actually know, which is another problem we'll talk about later. But we need to, because it's an insidious, an unseen killer, we need to and there's no cure for mesothelioma. We need to, prevention is the way forward, and we need to be doing all we can to prevent exposure to asbestos in situ, and that means the better management of asbestos in situ. Okay, so
we've got management. We'll probably go on to in a minute. What about registers? The asbestos register. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, since 2002, we've had the duty to manage asbestos. So that's a duty to manage asbestos in situ. A great leap forward happened in 2002, which is 2 years after the ban on asbestos. And indeed, that was deemed at the time to be the first of a phase of asbestos legislation, which went on to help us manage the existing asbestos menace. Watch this space. Hopefully we'll get some progressive changes in asbestos legislation, as indeed other leading European nations have done. So back to the register. So we've done all the hard bit, we've done all the surveying, but they're kept locally, and they're not kept in a common format. So really, we've got our asbestos registers are divided and therefore conquered, and the asbestos hazard is not conquered across the nation. We don't have visibility, don't have any really national visibility over the size and scale of our asbestos problem. We ought to know at an instant the number of schools, for example, which contain asbestos, but the estimates, you know, we ought not to be using estimates, but they vary from 85 to 70%. There's, I think the best figure we have is something like 79%. And that, you know, we ought to be able to nail that one. That's a pretty crude measurement, isn't it? Going on from that, we ought to have a national dashboard. You know, as we do with COVID, we've got statistics coming at us all the time now, and with that, we've got transparency. I check the local number of cases in my area every day to see how I'm getting on. basically to inform myself if if it's more dangerous out
And we've
there.
moved to that like that, haven't we? We've clicked to
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Now we've done all the hard work gathering the data, but we've just, and the technology's there. The rates, we all know about the rate of technological change. The technology is there now for us to have a national asbestos database, as do the Dutch and as do the Flemish. So the precedent's there as well. So do we have a need? You bet we have a need. We've got more asbestos than any other nation in the world, and we've got the highest mesothelioma deaths than anybody else in the world. So why don't we do it? Well, this is where the cynic in me kind of bubbles up. I think we're kind of dividing and conquering the problem. We're not recognizing the increased power of technology, and we're kind of obfuscating or wishing to kind of, we are not allowing ourselves to have complete transparency of a problem. And we ought to be. Don't forget, it's the UK's #1 occupational killer. Mm-hmm. Transparency and clarity. Blow the barn doors off, as we've done with COVID. There will be, you know, it's quite a good example actually with COVID. For the first 2 weeks, we're in a state of panic. Now it's okay, let's get serious about the data. There's no panic out there now. There's pragmatism about how we can solve the problem. That's what we ought to do with asbestos. It's in public buildings. It's a public problem. Why isn't that data? Why isn't that data public? It ought to be public. So that's my thoughts on a register. More profoundly, you know, there's an old phrase of what isn't measured isn't managed, and that's the other key theme with databases. If it's measured and it's viewed publicly, the public will hold our institutions to account and see what the risks are, how many pieces of asbestos insulation board there are in a given school, in a given hospital, or so on and such forth. There will be proper pressure to sort the problem out. That's what you get with transparency. The means to sort it and the motivation to sort out the problem. If we don't have transparency, we've got obfuscation of the problem.
That comparison is like a light bulb moment to me, you know, and also we also have people who disagree and despair and say that there isn't a problem. So I think we have that in COVID, and we have that in asbestos-related disease, or the use of asbestos, or the awareness of asbestos. That's as I say, an amazing bringing together of those 2 points. What would you say about air monitoring then?
Well, we know that asbestos is very, very common throughout our public buildings. You know, 78% of schools, 56% of it was 100% of hospitals, which just can't be right. 56% of high street schools, high street stores, and all the rest of it. I could go on. So we know that the materials are out there, but it's not that we don't breathe in the materials; they're too big. It's the microscopic fibers that we breathe in. So if we're managing asbestos in situ, surely we ought to have a measure of the microscopic fibers that we are breathing in. We don't. The air tests that we do are insufficiently sensitive. The pass level of what we call a clearance indicator is set at a level of concentration in the air that is described in HSE literature as a level known not to be safe. So we've got the only safety standard for the UK's #1 occupational killer, and it's set at a level known not to be safe. I'm afraid that's just not, frankly, not good enough. Other nations have changed their microscopy regime to 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, to enable a sensitivity of 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more sensitive. And that's the approach we ought to be doing in the UK. Again, it's a kind of aged obfuscation of the problem. What really upset me really at work, and one of the things I spoke out about, is on a routine basis, we hand out certificates to the layman who doesn't have a thorough understanding of the fibre levels and how they're going to manifest disease later on in life. And they'd be entitled either a clearance test, which implies that the area is clear, or reassurance air test, to imply that the reader ought to be reassured by the air testing work which has been done. It's a proof of safety. But the level is described as a level known not to be safe. So we are literally putting false reassurance into the hands of people who we ought to be assuring of their safety. Therefore, the air testing regime is frankly unfit for purpose. Can we do better? Yes. Well, in order to vastly increase the sensitivity, you just need to run your air testing pumps for an additional half hour, look at more fields down a microscope. So those are two really simple practical tests, but we've got to get real about managing asbestos in situ, and that means measuring the fibre concentrations at a low level, because you only need a low level of concentration to the nasty fibre types. So we've got to get real about fibre testing in situ. It can be done. It's just an update to the testing regime, as they do in Holland, in France, in Germany, and in the States, in the schools in the States. So it's, to be bold, I say the reason we don't do it is because if we were to do it at a national scale, we might just evidence the fact that we've got a problem of asbestos in situ. I mean, I think there's this niggling doubt amongst the regulators, the HSE, but if we were to use the latest techniques at scale, then we'd evidence the problem. But that is the reason why we ought to be doing testing, because you can prevent future early deaths. If you go finding the problem, well, there's reason to believe we have a problem. That's obvious. We've got asbestos is frankly riddled through lots of our public buildings. So is there cause there? Yes. Is that cause? Is it getting disturbed? But we can only prove that through regular air testing. So that's why we ought to be doing it. We ought to change the presumption that all asbestos is safe in situ to all asbestos is guilty in situ, all asbestos is unsafe in situ unless proven safe through testing. I mean, there's numerous parallels with the COVID test, track and trace system. We've done the tracking. We know where it is. We ought to do, what we ought to do next is testing to prove whether that asbestos is giving off fibres. You know, that's what we ought to be doing, or assure ourselves that we're safe and carry on. So that's my thoughts on testing. It's woefully inadequate. Others doing it better. We've got the worst mesothelioma rates in the world. We've got more asbestos per building, per tonnage, per capita imported into this country than anyone else in the world. We used more amosite, particularly, known to be more carcinogenic, particularly for mesothelioma. That's why our mesothelioma rates are so high. And we could use testing, as they do with COVID, to properly get a grip on it. That's what I need to say about testing.
Yeah, I think I was going to ask you to just say the measures to move forward on controlling asbestos and how we manage asbestos. I think you've just done that for me in that excellent summing up. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
Oh, right. Well, how do we go forward from here? Well, I've talked about the database. I mean, that's the hard work's done. It would be relatively inexpensive to do. We could definitely do testing. The testing regimes are used in other countries. Why we don't doing it? Well, I've got my thoughts on that. And a national asbestos strategy. You know, the bans on asbestos are now 20 years old. What's next? All this asbestos we've had in situ is deteriorating. The risks are therefore increasing. They're more likely to give off fibres. What's next? How about phased removal? How about using a national asbestos database to tell us where the high-risk asbestos items are in the vulnerable places so that we can target our finite resources onto those articles? I'll repeat, actually, I do believe that 90% of asbestos can be managed perfectly adequately in situ. We've only got a problem with the 10% high-risk asbestos items, high-risk materials and high-risk fiber types in high-risk problems, in high-risk places. So high-risk asbestos, and in places where there are children, bang, that's where we ought to be concentrating our finite resource. And yeah, so that's my thoughts on a pragmatic way forward. Testing and prioritization.
Thanks, Charles. It's always really interesting to speak to you and very enlightening with all the experience you have. Charles Pickles, thank you very much for speaking to me today. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.